Hi, my name is Tim Riesen. I'm a research assistant professor in the Department of Special Education and Rehabilitation at Utah State University. Today I'm going to be talking to you about building relationships with employers. And what I have in store for you, or what I would like to achieve today, is I want to first talk about the importance of integrated employment for people with disabilities. So I'm going to be spending a little bit of time giving you some background information about some outcomes for people with disabilities and potentially some potential directions about how we are moving forward in terms of employment for people with disabilities. And then I would like to review a study that I conducted in 2017 with employers about their views of customized employment. So we did a series of focus groups with employers, and I'm going to spend some time reviewing some of the data, reviewing some of the themes that emerged from this focus group study. And then I'm going to conclude today's presentation with some recommendations for practice and future research. So hopefully this presentation will give you some insights about how we can build better relationships with employers from a customized employment standpoint, and what that means from a practical standpoint, how employment specialists can really engage with employers to produce better outcomes for youth and young adults and adults with disabilities. So I think before we start talking about building relationships and understanding how to engage with employers, it's really important to kind of explore what's happening in terms of employment outcomes for people with disabilities. And I think this is a really interesting time in terms of employment, considering that last month the United States had one of the biggest job growths in recent history since the 1980s. So we had this incredible job growth for people without disabilities, but people with disabilities haven't been traditionally involved in these job growth paradigms. So if you look at some of these outcomes and you look at kind of what's happened with people with disabilities over the years, we see that people with disabilities aren't necessarily achieving employment outcomes with the same frequency that people without disabilities are achieving. So there have been a number of seminal studies, or a number of outcome studies that have really reinforced this idea that people with disabilities aren't achieving these outcomes to the same extent that people without disabilities are achieving. The American Community Survey, which is an annual supplement to the U.S. Census, collects data annually on outcomes for people with disabilities, and this is a broad range of disability categories. And they found, in the latest iteration of the American Community Survey, they found that roughly 33.7% of individuals with disabilities between the ages of 16 and 64 are employed. So these data really suggest that that people with disabilities just aren't accessing employment to the same extent that people without disabilities are accessing. If you start looking at disabilities, specific disabilities, such as intellectual developmental disabilities, or when we start looking at what's happening in terms of employment outcomes for people with more significant support needs, the numbers drop quite precipitously. The state data report on employment services and outcomes for people with intellectual developmental disabilities suggests that only 18.6% of people with intellectual developmental disabilities are employed in integrated environments. Another study, the National Core Indicator Project, suggests that only 14.8% of individuals with intellectual disabilities who are receiving DD services or developmental disability services are employed in integrated settings. So this leaves a large number of individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities not engaging in meaningful employment. So oftentimes these individuals are served in more congregate type settings, such as work and non-work facility-based settings, where they're not really working on employment skills and they're not really participating in community employment. So these numbers, in light of what we know about the economic growth in this country, are quite alarming, in that people with disabilities seem to be left out of the game in many circles when it comes to employment outcomes. So when we start thinking about why this happens, or why people with disabilities do not participate in employment with the same frequency that people without disabilities participate in employment. Both researchers and advocates have really, I guess, highlighted a number of contributing factors, right? So we've looked at these variables that really examine why people with disabilities don't participate in employment with the same frequency that people without disabilities participate in employment. And we're talking about people with more significant disabilities. One of these factors is the lack of applied inclusive work experiences for people with disabilities. So oftentimes the way we've structured programs and services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities or people with more significant support needs is that we set up contrived work experiences for these individuals. And so they don't necessarily develop the same work identity that perhaps a person without a disability would develop over the lifespan, because the experiences that they participate in aren't necessarily realistic and aren't necessarily tied to the performance demands of real work. So these lack of applied work experiences certainly contribute to these poor outcomes that we see each year. Another contributing factor is this kind of idea of a readiness paradigm. And this idea is something that we don't set up for people without disabilities. Oftentimes, we have a certain set of standards that we say a person with a disability has to achieve, or a certain set of competencies that a person with a disability has to achieve before he or she can enter into the employment realm. And we don't establish these same criteria for people without disabilities. So we're working on this different kind of mindset with people without disabilities and people with disabilities, that we oftentimes assume that a person with a disabilities has to ensure or has to demonstrate certain competencies before this person or the individual with a disability can engage in meaningful employment. And then finally, we have traditionally low employment expectations for people with disabilities. So oftentimes we don't think about employment as a viable option, and especially the more significant a person's support needs tend to be. The expectations seem to correlate with those, with the significance of a person's disability. So each of these three contributing factors certainly influence those poor outcomes that that I showed you earlier, the American Community Survey and the state data. These factors certainly relate to these poor employment outcomes. But another item that we oftentimes don't talk about in terms of poor employment outcomes is what Tammy Baccarat called in 2015 an incomplete agenda. And essentially what she was referring to here is that oftentimes we spend so much time trying to rehabilitate or get a person ready to work or build certain capacities or build certain competencies with a person with a disability, and the onus is on the person with a disability to get ready for work, that we don't spend enough time working with employers and understanding how we can engage with employers. So Tammy talks about this incomplete agenda, that we focus solely on providing education and support to people with disabilities, and we don't always look at what employers need. We don't always look at the barriers that employers might have in terms of hiring a person with a disability. So this leads us to where we're headed in terms of employment, that I think we're at a crossroads in terms of developing supports and services for people with disabilities that really requires us to start thinking about how we can more effectively engage with employers to learn about how we can work with them and learn how perhaps we can rehabilitate the employment environment, just as we're trying to provide supports and rehabilitation to people with disabilities. So we need to work together. We don't work in isolation. So we need to work with the person with a disability, and we simultaneously need to work with employers to ensure that we're meeting the needs of both. So from a legislative standpoint, the legislation is clearly responding to these poor outcomes and is clearly responding to these factors that have really prevented good outcomes for people with disabilities. And most recently, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act in 2014 was really kind of a response to these poor employment outcomes. And a number of things that this specific piece of legislation did is that first and foremost was it was really designed to improve employment outcomes for people with the most significant disabilities. So if you go back to the outcomes that I showed you a couple slides ago, and you look at these outcomes, you look at broad categories of disabilities, and roughly 36% of people with disabilities are employed. When you start looking at significant disabilities, those numbers just drop. 14, 18% employment rate in integrated environments. And so WIOA really, or WIOA really responded to these poor outcomes. And it said, you know what, from a service provision standpoint, we need to do more to promote these better outcomes for people with significant disabilities. So one of the things that WIOA did is, for the first time from a statutory standpoint, it defined competitive integrated employment. So now we have a complete definition of what employment means, right? So competitive integrated employment simply means that a person with a disability is employed in environments where the majority of people working in that environment do not have a disability. So it's just regular employment environments. And one of the other items embedded within this piece of legislation is the modification of supported employment to include a definition of customized employment. So although customized employment has been around since 2001, it hasn't necessarily been embedded within the statute until 2014, when this definition was included, when the definition of customized employment was included in the Rehabilitation Act itself. So WIOA basically defines customized employment as something that's designed to meet the specific abilities of an individual with a significant disability and the business needs of the employer. So once again, if you look at this definition and you look at the incomplete agenda that I was addressing earlier, this is really trying to respond to this idea that if we're going to make employment work for people with the most significant disabilities, we have to look at the individual with a disability and identify his or her strengths and interests as they relate to employment, while we simultaneously look at the employer and identify what the employer needs in terms of employment. So customized employment, in essence, really recognizes that we need to work with both person with a disability and employers in order to promote these better outcomes. The importance of building relationships and working with employers has also been highlighted in the literature. Most recently, WINTAC, the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center, has released an essential elements of customized employment last year, 2017. And basically this essential elements document highlights, what individuals or what the customized employment process looks like, from discovery all the way to working with employers. And some of the components that I thought would be worthwhile to address, because it relates exactly to the focus group study that I'm going to be sharing with you here shortly, they highlight some really important characteristics of the customized employment process. First and foremost is that we negotiate job duties, right? So when we're working within a customized employment kind of context or paradigm, that we are negotiating a specific job duty. So if we're truly customizing a job for a person with a disability, traditionally that job didn't exist before we started talking to an employer. So this was going to certainly require employment specialists to have, a certain set of skills, to really work with the employer and talk about or learn about these unmet needs and then negotiate these job duties. It's individualized, so it's one job for one person. So from a customized employment standpoint, we're not going in and developing or customizing jobs for a number of persons. We're spending time with one individual and one employer, And we're really trying to create a job or customize a job that meets the needs for both individuals, or both the individual with a disability and the employer. That the businesses are in the community, so this is integrated community employment, and that the employment specialists develop strategies for assisting the employers to identify areas in which the employer might benefit. So once again, this goes back to this idea of the incomplete agenda that I was referencing earlier, that we need to spend more time engaging with employers to identify these unmet needs, or to identify ways in which we can meet the needs of the employer, and simultaneously meeting the needs of the person with the disabilities as it relates to their strengths and interests, right? A mutual benefit needs to happen. Customized employment avoids job openings and typical personnel processes when we're approaching employers. So once again, this requires the employment specialist to kind of step outside the box, do things a little bit differently than we have traditionally done when we're looking at traditional supply side jobs. So supply side jobs are those that, the specific positions that an employer may have, where one would fill out an application and then go through the traditional routes to employment. Well, customized employment is the antithesis of that, right? So we are avoiding those job openings, and it's going to require the employment specialists to really learn how to approach employers and engage with employers. And this is one thing that we were trying to flush out with the focus group information that I will share with you here shortly. And then, of course, during the customized employment process, that there is some representation, typically through an employment specialist, a job development employment specialist, or somebody that can represent that individual during this customization process. So the WINTAC document really sets the foundation, or talks about this importance of building these relationships with employers and engaging with employers. The U.S. Department of Labor, the ODEP, also developed specific indicators that are requisite for customized employment. And one of the indicators was creating personalized job descriptions and other employment expectations that didn't exist prior to the negotiation process. So once again, this was going to require some nuanced skills on behalf of the employment specialist to really negotiate these specific jobs. It's not something that one can go in and just do after one meeting, that this is going to require some communication. This is going to require some networking and some learning about business needs. And it's a process. It's not something that's just going to happen overnight. And then in 2013, there was a competency model for customized employment that was developed by the folks listed in the references there. And essentially what they were looking at is specific competencies that are required, that are kind of needed in order to facilitate the customized employment process. Several of the things related to developing business relationships were that employment specialists need to possess the knowledge and skills to understand businesses and specific employment practices, and that employment specialists need to be proficient at business networking. So the U.S. Department of Labor, the competency model, the WINTAC document, all are pointing to this direction of working more efficiently with employers, learning how to identify unmet needs, learning how to engage with businesses more proficiently, rather than just going in and asking an employer if they're hiring, that we need to start building these relationships with employers in order to make employment work, in order to improve these poor outcomes that we see every year. And in fact, some of those outcomes are decreasing, right? They seem to be getting worse, not better. And so all of the research, legislation is all pointing to this direction, that we need to do more to interface more effectively with employers, so we can promote these better outcomes. So there have been a number of studies over the past several years, or since we've been doing employment for people with disabilities, that have really looked at employer perspectives on hiring and retaining individuals with disabilities. But most of these studies are centered around traditional approaches to employment. So once again, using those standard kind of approaches, looking at positions, filling out applications, working with the traditional paradigm for employment. they haven't necessarily looked at the customized employment process. In fact, I did a review of the literature in 2015 and looked at all the literature out there on customized employment, the research literature, and we found in this review that there is very little information about how employment specialists can engage with employers, right? That there hasn't been a lot of research in this specific area, with one notable exception, and that is a study done by Lucking in 2016, or 2006, excuse me, in which he and his colleagues conducted some telephone interviews with 9 employers who had hired individuals through a customized employment process. And what the authors found in this specific study is that, customized employment does work, right? That employers were generally satisfied with the customized employment process, that it did indeed meet the employer needs, and it helped meet production goals, and it improved customer satisfaction. But the study, one of the things that the study did not do is it didn't provide information about how we start to engage with employers, how we start this process of building the relationships with employers and engaging with them to learn about their business needs, or to learn about how we can customize a job for a person with a disability. So this is what we attempted to do in the focus group study that I'm going to share with you here right now. So last year we conducted a focus group study with employers to learn about what they thought about the customized employment process. So we wanted to learn about what they thought were facilitators and barriers to this customized employment process. So the specific research question that we ask is, given a training on customized employment, a brief training on customized employment, what do employers with no expectations with customized employment identify as facilitators and barriers to this process? So when we were kind of conceptualizing the study and thinking through this study, we wanted to identify employers that had no experience with customized employment. And the reason why we chose to identify employers with no experience with customized employment is because we kind of wanted to learn how employers would respond to this idea of customized employment, or to this customized employment paradigm. And so we didn't want them to have any formal experience with this process. So what we did is we recruited employers in one state to participate in this study, and our recruitment efforts consisted of we used the Workforce Services database of employers, which consisted of about 80,000 employers in this specific state. And we randomly selected 175 employers from this 80,000, this list of 80,000 employers. So we did a random numbers table and selected these employers. And then we gave the task of calling these employers to a research assistant who called the employers to ask them if they'd like to participate in the focus group study. And of those 175 employers, roughly 75 of those telephone numbers were, for various reasons, either disconnected or wrong numbers. So that left about 66 contacts employers that we were able to contact, or the research assistant was able to contact. And of those 66, 14 employers agreed to participate in the study. So we were a little bit worried about the numbers here and a little bit worried about the N. And so we wanted to try to get more employers to participate in this focus group. And we contacted the state's Governor's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities, and we asked the director to forward a recruitment email to people employers on their listserv, asking if they would like to participate in the study too. So from the Governor's Committee recruitment efforts, we had about 10 employers who expressed some interest in participating in the study as well. So all in all, we had about 24 employers who said that they would participate in the focus group studies. After everything was said and done, 10 employers actually participated in the focus group. So we had some commitments, but some employers didn't actually attend the focus group. So we had 10 employers that participated in the focus group. So as you can see from the slide, we had some representation from various different types of industries. So we used the standard occupational classification system, the SOC codes, to classify the specific industry that employers were representing in the focus group. And if you can see from the slide that we had some folks from retail, we had some employers that were engaged in transportation, manufacturing, construction, healthcare, technology and information, and so forth. So we had a pretty diverse group of employers that participated in the focus group. 4 of the employers had 1 to 25 employees. So 4 of these employers were small businesses, or what we would consider small businesses. 1 employer had 76 to 100 employees, and the other the other businesses had over 101 employees, so they were considered large businesses. 4 of the employers had experience hiring people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the past, but they hired these individuals through traditional methods of employment. They didn't customize a job for these specific individuals. So prior to the focus group, and this is where the training kind of, where we implemented some training so employers could have some basic knowledge of customized employment before we started to ask targeted questions about what they thought about customized employment, is we sent the employers who participated or who were going to participate in the online focus groups a short 3-minute and 40-second video that was created by the ODEP on customized employment. So this 3-minute video, 3-minute 40-second video, basically presented 3 vignettes of people with disabilities working in customized employment in some context, and it also provided interviews by national experts in customized employment, talking about the benefits of customized employment, kind of identifying what it is, and providing some contextual information about customized employment. And then the video provided interviews with employers who had hired the 3 individuals highlighted in the vignettes. And basically the employers were talking about the benefits of customized employment, how they utilize the customized employment process, and so on and so forth. So this video basically gave you know, some contextual information about customized employment, and we decided to use this video so the employers had some background information about customized employment. We also had the employers fill out a brief Qualtrics survey, which Qualtrics is just an online platform, data collection platform, where we collected some demographic information about the number of employers, types of purpose of the businesses and services, positions of the people who are participating in the focus group, and just basic demographic information from the employers. And then we implemented the focus groups. So we did a synchronous online focus group with the employer. So we chose to do an online focus group simply because we wanted to try to accommodate employer schedules. So, you know, as we saw, we had 24 employers that initially agreed and only 10 showed up. So it's really difficult to get employers to engage in these research efforts. And synchronous online focus groups have been used a lot in healthcare research. You know, folks are seeing that there's some utility to utilizing this type of methodology to gather information from focus group participants. It also allows for geographic diversity, so people can be in different areas of a state or be spread out geographically across the country in order to participate in these focus groups. And it's really easy to collect the data when we use these online focus groups. So we used what's called a program called Adobe Connect for people to participate in the focus group, and this allows us to record the focus group in its entirety online, and so we have the data collections is kind of taken care of for us. So we conducted 3 separate focus groups. So once again, we gave employers the opportunity to select which group they wanted to participate. So we wanted to give them different times so they can show up, and we conducted 75-minute sessions. So we spent an hour and 15 minutes talking to employers to really learn about what they thought were what they thought were facilitators and barriers to the customized employment process. We used qualitative methodology, right? So we used open-ended focus group questions or interview questions, and basically the question in the little bubble box on your screen gives you an example of one of the questions that we asked. So we'd ask, what factors influence you and your business to customize jobs for people with disabilities? So we'd start with that question, and then we'd ask probing questions when the employers responded. So we'd give each employer an opportunity to respond. And prior to asking these questions, I facilitated the focus groups, and prior to asking these questions, I spent some time addressing any knowledge-based questions or questions that they had as a result of watching the video. So they were a little bit more informed about the customized employment process. And once again, these focus groups were digitally recorded, and then we had a independent research assistant transcribe each of the focus group sessions. And then we uploaded these transcriptions into an online qualitative software program called Deduce. And we started to look for themes or identify specific themes related to our discussion. And the purpose of this study was really to highlight or identify what employers thought were facilitators and barriers. And then we classified these into specific themes related to customized employment. So here are the themes, and this is what kind of emerged as a result of this study. First and foremost, employers were really highlighted the need to identify business needs. They thought it was really important that we spend a lot more time in businesses, learning about businesses, and talking to employers to learn about their business needs. They talked a lot about the importance of networking. Communication permeated all discussions about customized employment. There were employers basically or essentially said, if there's not solid communication that happens during this customized employment process, if we don't fully communicate with employers and people with disabilities, employment specialists, then there are going to be a number of barriers to this process. Training emerged as a theme, and there were some financial implications too, that employers were concerned about some of the financial aspects of customized employment. So I'm going to spend some time talking about each one of these themes and provide some direct quotes from employers so you get a sense of what employers were thinking about this customized employment process. So in terms of business needs, every single focus group, the employers really highlighted the importance of learning about businesses and spending more time engaging with businesses to really find those unmet needs. So once again, when we're thinking about how this all connects to some of the information that I presented earlier about this incomplete agenda, right here, this idea of business need is really reinforced, or employers really reinforce this idea that if we're going to make this work, and if we're going to promote better outcomes for people with disabilities, and if employers are going to indeed hire or customize jobs for people with disabilities, we employment specialists or those supporting people with disabilities in a customized employment context really need to do more to learn about business needs. It's not just a one-time approach or a one-shot approach in working with businesses, that they want us to spend more time interacting and learning about businesses and learning how their businesses operate so we can find those unmet needs. So this was kind of reinforced in several of the quotes that employers talked about in terms of the focus group. One employer said, you know what, when you're learning about business needs, don't come in and ask if we're hiring. Well, number one, that runs counter to the customized employment process, but they're saying just come in and pay attention, ask really good questions, think creatively about how to fashion a job. So employers are like, we want people who could come in and solve our unmet needs. We want people who can ask those questions and can be observant and see what needs to be done at the business, and then also take that information and align it to the strengths and interests of the person with a disability. Another employer said, you know, I'd want an individual to come in and spend multiple days working in different aspects of the business, meeting with me so they can have a really true understanding of how our business works and the different levels of our business, right? So this employer was like, spend time with us. If we're going to make employment work, if we're going to make this customized employment process work, it's going to be time consuming, and that we have to spend some good quality time with the employer, learning about the employer, right? So hopefully we've done that with the person with a disability through the discovery process. Now we're doing this with the business. We're learning about these business needs. And once again, it's not something that's just going to happen in one day. Employers want us to engage with them over multiple days, learning about businesses, learning about the function of their business, learning about the layers of their business, learning how they operate. Another employer said, you know what, they should do a level of hands-on work themselves so they can understand the process. They understand what we're doing, what the business is, what the business does specifically. Then the employer said, you know, if we do some hands-on work, or if we engage with the employer, that there would be some accountability built into this process, that the employment specialist would really understand what happens in the specific business. There were a number of barriers that were identified in terms of establishing business needs. And there are some things that we've seen in the past, and this came from employers who have had some experience working with community rehabilitation providers using a traditional approach, that have been something that they have not liked, or they've perceived as a barrier in terms of this process. And one of which is being too pushy and not really taking no for an answer. So they were saying, as you're coming in and learning about a business, you know, don't be pushy. And if an employer isn't willing to work with the employment specialist, that's okay. There are other businesses out there that are going to be willing to work, and they don't want folks who are too pushy. They also said, you know, one of the barriers is just not asking what the business needs are, right? So just coming in and saying, are you hiring? Which once again runs counter to the customized employment process, that we're not asking if an employer is hiring at this point. We're not looking to fill positions. We're looking to create and customize jobs. So an employer said, if you don't come in and ask, what can we do? What can the employment specialist do for you, and how can we help your company? The employers said that they'll be more reluctant to work with the employment specialist. So it really requires the employment specialist to be really observant during this process, and then asking the right questions. How can we benefit you, right? How can we make this work? And how can we fulfill some needs that perhaps aren't being met, right? And then align that to the strengths and interests of the person with a disability. And this last one is a really interesting kind of barrier that we've seen in the literature over and over again, and employers have expressed this in other studies, is really not knowing. Employers have articulated that they are reluctant to work with people who don't know the process themselves. So one employer in this specific example said that they were working with a community rehabilitation provider using a traditional method to employment. And they said one of the things that really presented a barrier to a continued relationship and learning about business need was this CRP, or community rehabilitation provider, didn't know the process themselves. They didn't know what it looked like. So the employer said, we actually had a provider come in and speak to us, and that person didn't understand their business well. They were here for a particular candidate, but when the team asked questions, they weren't capable of answering the questions. So once again, when we're thinking about this process and thinking about how we start to engage with employers, we need to ask targeted questions about the businesses, but we also have to be able to answer specific questions about what the process looks like, and about what we as a provider, or we as an employment specialist, can provide to the employer, because they want that specific information. Networking was another critical component of that employers felt like was an important component of the customized employment process. And employers said, you know, when we're networking or when you're thinking about networking, we really want to hear from other employers who have customized in the past, right? They thought that this was a really important piece, and this would be one of the things that would really influence their decision to hire or to customize a job for a person with a disability if they saw it working in action. And I think this kind of is a direct result of the employers only seeing a 2-minute video or a 3-minute, 40-second video of the customized employment process and not fully understanding how it works and how it fits within their structures. So they were like, we want to learn more about this. So if you're an employment specialist working with an employer, you know, it might be prudent or might be worth your while to share some of the success stories that you've had in the past with other businesses in your local area in customizing a job. Employers want that information. They want to see how it works so they can conceptualize how that would fit within their business, right? So one employer said, I think the employment specialist would need to have some examples of past successes with other companies and show how they've worked with other companies. So, you know, they basically want to see how this stuff works. Another employer said, I'd like to see some form of videos that kind of show how it works. So this aligns with what people are already doing in terms of developing digital portfolios and showing, you know, of people with disabilities performing in different contexts. So we can show this to businesses and show how this process works. But this is going to require us to maintain our networks in local communities so we can, you know, ask a business, you know, hey, I'm working with another business. Can I show, can you talk about how customized employment has benefited your business? Employers also said, you know what, it would be really important for employment specialists to engage in networking activities that businesses typically do. So this would be attending chamber meetings or attending local employment advisory committees or so on and so forth. And they said this isn't important to get jobs, it's just important to learn about business in general. They're like, if we want to work with employment specialists who are trying to create and customize jobs, we want them to have a certain level of business acumen. We want them to understand how business principles, and you learn that through networking through these specific entities where businesses engage. So networking was an important piece of this, an important theme. And as I indicated earlier, communication was something that permeated all discussions related to the customized employment process. They were like, if we're going to work with folks to customize a job, communication is key. And this makes sense. We have to be able to clearly articulate what we're trying to do in terms of a customized employment process, simply because employers, when we're talking to employers, they typically work off you know, job positions or creating positions and job announcements. And here, from a customized employment standpoint, we're doing the opposite of that. We're going in and working with the employer and talking about unmet needs and talking about customizing a position, a job that wasn't there before we started to engage with the employers. And so employers need to have this clear communication, and we need to clearly articulate what this process looks like for the employer and for the person with a disability. So the employment specialist, in essence, really serves as a liaison between the employer and the person with a disability, and that employment specialist needs to really clearly convey what this process looks like and convey, you know, how we're going to make this customized employment process work from negotiation all the way to training and follow along, how a person is going to maintain those relationships. So a couple of the things that the employer said that would be really helpful from a communication standpoint is to ensure that once a placement has been made or once a job has been customized for an individual with a disability, is to ensure that the employment specialist really does regular check-ins. So one of the things that they talked about in the focus groups is they're concerned that if they customize a job for a person with a disability, that once they make that decision to customize a job, that the employer wouldn't have any support. to help, make sure that the customized employee is doing the job as negotiated. So they're like, we want the employment specialist to do regular check-ins, to conduct performance reviews. One employer said, to make sure that that the person with a disability is actually doing as meeting the unmet needs that were negotiated. Another employer said, you know what, come in and talk to us about after this decision has been made to customize a job and working with this person over a number of months or however long, come in and ask us specific questions about what are some of the challenges, and have us identify what's working and what's not working, and maintain these lines of communication so that that person can maintain a job over a long period of time. So they're like, we want the employment specialist to continually engage in effective communication across the board, not just during negotiation, but during job training and follow along and so on and so forth. Some other interesting comments that came up related to communication is just kind of presenting information about the customized employee itself. And one employer specifically said, you know what, we kind of do a discovery mode with all of our employees, all of our candidates that we're interviewing, and we put together a summary package about why this person is a perfect fit for the position. So they're saying that they do this for people without disabilities. And guess what? This is exactly what we should be doing in terms of customized employment, right? If we've done our discovery well enough, we've highlighted a person's strengths and interests as they relate to employment, and then we need to clearly present that information to the employer and say, this is what the person's strengths and interests are. This is what the person can bring to your business. This is what we've identified as perhaps some unmet needs, or something that needs to be that would benefit your business, and present this package to the employer, right? Another employer said, present somebody's strengths and weaknesses, and give us information about what they enjoy, right? So they're like, present a really good positive profile about the person, and also talk about their weaknesses, right? Because everybody, and the employer talked about this, so they said everybody has some weaknesses in terms of employment, disability or not. And the employer said, this is something that we try to do anyways as we get new employees. We get people going. We start to realize what employees are good at. Some people are good at some things and others are terrible. So you try to line up people with what their strengths are. So employers understand this idea of aligning people in a business based on their strengths, and having them do tasks within that business based on their specific strengths and interests. So as an employment specialist, and as we're engaging with the employer, it becomes incumbent upon that employment specialist to present this information in ways that the business understands, and in ways that can convey the utility of customized employment. Training was another theme that arose, and one of the things that the employers talked about is they're like, we're concerned about working with people with disabilities, and concerned about working in particular with people with more significant disabilities. And this is something that we see across the board, that employers do have some reservations about supporting and working with people with disabilities, particularly those with more significant disabilities. So the employers were like, but this isn't a barrier. We just want to learn how to do it. We want to learn how to support a person with a disability, and learn how to interact with a person with a disability at the workplace, right? So they're like, spend some time talking about how to support, or teaching somebody at the business how to support a person with a disability. Employers also talked about this idea of trying an employee out before bringing that person on full time. So this aligns with this idea of doing some job tryouts, and having a person kind of try some tasks out at the business before they make a decision to hire that person or customize a long-term job for the individual. And they talk about, look, we do this for people without disabilities all the time. We call it a contract to hire scenario. So maybe as we're talking to employers and learning this business language, learning how to interface with employers a little bit more effectively, we can start using some of the language that they are talking about to convey, like, convey how we're going to support a person with a disability from this, using this construct. Employers also said, you know what, we want specific training on how to handle issues that they may not be comfortable in handling, right? So they're like, just, tell us how we work in certain situations and provide us that in-depth training. So once again, this is going to require an employment specialist to really be able to communicate this information, but also be really knowledgeable about all these areas of employment for people with disabilities, from providing specific supports about training, doing systematic instruction, and so on and so forth, and then conveying that information to the employer about, this is how we can support a person with a disability on the job. And then financial. There were some financial concerns that employers kind of addressed in terms of this customized employment process. And I think as we started to review these financial concerns, a lot of these arose because employers didn't fully understand the customized employment process. So employers really seemed to struggle with this, with the concept of customization and what this means for their business. So a couple of these quotes from employers illustrate the struggle that these employers are having. One employer specifically said, we just don't have the funds to do it financially because we don't have the extra padding or luxury for extra labor. So I think this quote right here really illustrates that the employer may not fully understand what we're trying to do in terms of a customized job for a person with a disability. That they are thinking, they're thinking that we're just going to have to spend extra money and that we're not going to get any benefit from it. And I think what we need to be really cognizant of when we're working with employers is to really convey this idea of mutual benefit, right? That isn't just extra labor, it's mutual benefit, that the customized employee is actually getting something done for that employee, that they're going to benefit from making a decision to customize a job for that person. Another employer said, we just can't create jobs because it sounds cool. It has to do a lot with forecasting and productivity as a company. And this quote came from a larger business or a larger corporation. So I think their concerns were when we're working in a larger, a larger corporation or businesses of over 101 employees, that there are certain channels that one has to go through in order to to hire a person with or without a disability. And so they're like, we have to use these certain channels, so it becomes more difficult to customize a job based on forecasting and so on and so forth. And I think this aligns with what a number of folks are saying about customization, and that it oftentimes is difficult to work with larger corporations because some of these institutional barriers that present themselves and going through the channels to hire a person with a disability. So I think based on these financial kind of concerns, that the employers may have a little bit of misunderstanding about what customized employment looks like. So this means that the employment specialist who is working with these businesses really needs to understand how to convey information about what the customized employment process looks like from a business standpoint, and how it can actually benefit the business rather than being a financial strain on the business. So what does all this mean, and some of the findings and implications for this study? Well, as I indicated, it seems to me, based on the small focus groups that we did, that employers don't fully understand this process. They don't fully understand the customized employment. And this was articulated in one quote by an employer. And this employer said, if a person didn't have the capacity to do a specific task, or learn the task, or required a lot of prompting to complete an employment task, we would not customize a job for that individual. And so I think this employer kind of doesn't understand what we're trying to do in terms of customized employment, and it might be the result of only watching a 3-minute video. If the person doesn't have the capacity to do a specific task, or that person requires a lot of direct prompting, or that they can't complete a task, then that's not a customized job. And so we have to be able to convey to the employer that it's not about a charity model or just putting somebody in there to do something that they can't do. It's about aligning that person's strengths and interests and what as they relate to employment, and aligning that to the needs of the employer. So the person with the disabilities is filling those needs of the employer. So there's mutual benefit. Engagement is critical. So if we don't have meaningful engagement during this customized employment process, then this whole process will not work. So employers are really reluctant to work with employment specialists who look for these quick placements. And we've seen this across the board in traditional models of employment, and we're seeing this now with customized employment, that if we don't critically engage and meaningfully engage, employers are just not willing to work with employment specialists. And as I indicated earlier, communication is essential. So this permeates all areas of the customized employment process, that we have to be really good at communicating with employers about what the model looks like, about how the supports are going to be tailored around the employer and the individual with a disability, so the person can perform the tasks as we negotiated those tasks. So specific recommendations and what we were kind of playing around with, and what we recommend in terms of building these relationships with employers and engaging with employers, is we talked a lot about making value propositions, and businesses do this all the time. So when we talk about value propositions, businesses use value propositions to engage customers to buy their goods and services. I think we need to take the same idea and embed it within a customized employment paradigm, that we need to use these value propositions in order to get employers to tap into our goods and services, strengths and interests of a person with a disability, and how they can meet those unmet needs. So employers have to see value in what we're trying to do. And value means that we've done our discovery well enough, we've matched strengths and interests to unmet needs, and we can clearly convey this to the employer, and clearly convey that we have a person with a disability who has these specific strengths, and they're going to work in your business, and they're going to provide value to the business, right? They're going to meet some unmet need that the business needs in order to be more productive, right? So this requires us to really spend a lot of time learning about businesses and learning about the nuances of specific businesses, so we can make those job matches. It's also going to require employment specialists to have that business acumen. And I talked about this earlier, that it's really important that employment specialists, from a customized employment standpoint, understand local business, understand how businesses operate, and that we can convey information about customized employment using business terminology. And this is something that businesses articulated in the focus group. They're like, we want employment specialists who understand business. And in fact, we think it would be better if employment specialists had some specific training related to business, so they can talk about the customized employment using some kind of business terminology, or terms that perhaps the business understands a little bit more effectively. And then networking. They said, we have to be proficient at networking and learning about local communities and learning about the connections that businesses have in their local communities. And that's really how we're going to start to identify customized employment opportunities. And finally, follow-up. Employers across the board indicated that they would need some pretty consistent follow-up in order to make customized employment work, to ensure that that the customized tasks are being completed, to ensure that the employer is satisfied with the performance demands of the customized employee, to examine business operations, to incorporate new tasks. As a person is working, maybe there are some other things that the customized employee can do to fulfill some unmet needs at the businesses, as long as they align with the strengths and interests of the employee. So these basic recommendations I think can really add value to the customized employment process. There's a couple limitations and suggestions for future research that we discussed in this study. First and foremost, the small number certainly limits the generalizations that could be made from this study. You know, we only had 10 employees or 10 employers who participated in the study. So that really limits what we can generalize about these findings. So we'd want to see maybe a larger sample, larger employer sample down the road, so we can start to really learn about what employers are thinking of the customized employment process. We didn't use a comparison group, which would certainly improve the results of the study if we looked at employers with and without customized employment experience, and we can compare the two. So these were some of the limitations with the study. In terms of future research, and what we're recommending is that future research should investigate the difference between employers with and without customized employment experiences, and really, examine the differences between these two employers. And since the findings of the study, or when we were examining the findings of the studies, some of the information that was presented really seemed to represent information that we've learned through traditional routes to employment, right? So some of these themes that we're seeing, we kind of saw those with, supported employment and so on and so forth. So in terms of future research, what we're recommending is that we provide perhaps some more extensive training to employers on the tenets of customized employment, right? So really exploring more than a 3-minute and 40-second video on the tenets of customized employment, and then ask more targeted questions about the customized employment process. So we can really, really flesh out what employers think will work and will not work in terms of the customized employment process. So I think this study provided some exploratory information about the customized employment process, and provides some good information about how employment specialists can perhaps better engage with employers to start this customization process. And I think we still have a lot to learn about how we can effectively engage with employers as we start to learn more about this customized employment process, and learn more about how to work with employers, small businesses, medium businesses, and large corporations. So with that said, I thank you for your time for the webcast today. If you have specific questions, you can post them on the comment board related to this webcast, and I will certainly answer any questions that you have related to this study, or anything related to the customized employment process. So again, thank you for your time, and I've appreciated presenting to you today.